The first and very simple question should be very naive. Sometimes it's useful to ask idiotic questions. Why is Russia so big? Or why are there so many Russians? Of course, in the big picture of things, we now know that the population of Russia is less than Pakistan, but just tells you more about Pakistan than Russia. Compared to other Slavs, there are lots of Russians. Compared to Czechs, Slovaks, or Bulgarians, there are so many Russians. Why is that? And look at the size of the state. I think it's quite obvious. It's the bad luck in the first 500 or 600 years, bordering on the steppe, with the steppe nomads on horseback attacking you continuously. And then for the next 400 or 500 years, it's a lot of luck, bordering on the steppe and its nomads who could be so easily overcome with gunpowder. So this is a typical story of geopolitics. Being somewhere isolated and far away is usually very bad, but sometimes it's also very good. So Russians lived long enough in their part of the world to have it both ways. So in the beginning, it was very bad. We can just leave it open, because there will be people coming, I'm sure. Yeah. I mentioned in the first lecture that according to Michael Mann, the predicament of the bad luck of historical sociologists is that we're historical, but we cannot be comparative, that we have nothing to compare with. We have one Europe, for instance. We have one Asia. We have one Earth. But there are actually some comparisons, and I want to draw your attention to the absolutely heroic work of University of Michigan historian Victor Lieberman, which he called himself Strange Parallels. He studied Burma, some of the countries which we almost never mention in any history course. Burma, Thailand. Thailand is only a tourist destination for majority of people, Cambodia. But that cluster of states had existed for more than 1,000 years. And when Lieberman went into studying he tried to write kind of world systems analysis of Burma and Thailand, he was struck by how many parallels there were with Eastern and Western Europe. And that's why the title of his 2 volumes, actually, they're pretty big books, Strange Parallels. How much in common does medieval Burma have in common with Kievan Rus, for instance? At first, Victor Lieberman himself was very suspicious of his parallels, but he went, those of you, I don't know, is Jane here? Those who have been to University of Michigan, well, of course, University of Michigan, that's where the famous Armenian Studies Center is located. But there is also Valery Kivelson, famous, one of the most important historians of medieval Russia. So it checks out on Valery Kivelson. She said, well, strangely enough, it works. So what do they have in common? Vietnam has one thing in common with Russia. It is also exposed to attacks from nomadic cavalry. Of course, the nomads had to go all over China first to attack Vietnam. But they did. It's a footnote to history, but the same regiment of Mongol cavalry, which in 1240 sacked Moscow, 2 years earlier had sacked Hanoi. So they went all the way on horseback from Hanoi to Moscow in the 13th century, speaking of globalization. It was not a very pleasant kind of globalization, but it was global. Where the cavalry could not reach was Burma, too far behind the mountains and the forests. And one place in Europe where the cavalry could not reach was, of course, France, and especially England. So remember, in the first lecture, I was saying that they had incredible geopolitical luck. First of all, the luck was that they were, 3 kinds of luck. First, historical luck. In Western Europe, they inherited a lot from Roman Empire. To this day, we're using Latin alphabet, after all, right? We're using the alphabet of Roman Empire. In medieval Europe, they might have lost the knowledge of Roman Empire, but it was easily regained. Coinage system, even the names of the coins to this day, so remain mostly, drachma, ancient Greek, or Roman, moneta, manat, somma, the som in Central Asia. Roman law, but of course, Romans left the towns, London, Vienna, whatever, Aachen, Paris were all founded as Roman fortresses originally. And Romans left also the very important network of monasteries. And to appreciate what monasteries were in medieval Europe, and this is actually very important, monasteries are the first capitalist corporations in history. To appreciate what monasteries were, I refer to Umberto Eco, Name of the Rose, usually read as a wonderful mystery novel, which it is. But also, please try to get a sense that monasteries were the first truly bureaucratic organizations in history. The organizations which were not inherited in families. Even Roman Empire, was inheritable possession of emperors at some point, later in Roman history. It was monarchy. Monasteries were republics, actually, republics of clergy. Monasteries were, of course, centers of education, centers of learning, and monasteries were very importantly the centers of economic development. Monasteries, when I say that to students in America, even in Abu Dhabi, it's very embarrassing because in America they're not supposed to drink before the age of 21. In a Muslim country, they're not supposed to drink at all. But look at the names of most of famous wines and beers in Western Europe, right? How many of them are Paulaner, Franziskaner, how many of them, Abbey Ale, and how many of them, Benedictine and so forth. But also dogs, Saint Bernard and so forth. What other religion has monasteries? Buddhism. And there I recommend highly, for another very important comparison, there is a work by Randall Collins. I mentioned Randall Collins already. And Randall Collins is the kind of, my former students know, those who are present here, that I always swore by the name of Randall Collins. The most important thing about Randall, who knows? He was the forward of the Harvard football team when he was a student. A big, big honor. He was raised in Berlin and grew up in Moscow because his father was American ambassador. So he was in Berlin in 1945. In summer, he was later in Moscow, and quite a personage. So Randall Collins, there is a book called Macro History. And in macro history, there is, you can write down yourself, there is a chapter called A Buddhist Road to Capitalism. Randall is probably one of the 2 or 3 most important Weberian sociologists today. I highly recommend Randall, anything Randall ever wrote. Randall is in that category that had he written a dinner menu, it would be worth reading. Still, a lot on the internet, so you can find the writings of Randall there. So in the chapter, which is called A Buddhist Road to Capitalism, he discusses the question why Japan was so precocious. So why outside of Europe it's only Japan which made it. And he shows that it's actually not only Japan, it's China. China was the first to develop a Buddhist monastic network. And those monasteries grew obscenely rich, just like in European history. They were not supposed to be rich, right? They were supposed to be poor. They're monks. They're all about spirituality, but they became very sophisticated and very rich because they were lay people coming to monasteries and bringing their gifts and getting from monasteries the blessings. And the blessings could be either very finely written amulets, books, pictures, statues. Eventually, in China, they began giving them tea. Well, not beer like in Europe, but tea, this very sophisticated tea. And in fact, branding, brand development, what is called today in schools of business, brand development, was first invented in China in the 8th century AD, just like everything, as you realize. And they also invented a very nice breed of dogs, which they get very special dogs, like Saint Bernard dogs. In Asia, that would be the Lhasa hound, to give to the people entering the monasteries. And as well, as you probably know, they also developed Kung Fu, of course, and Jiu-Jitsu, those martial arts. There was some kind of monks, which made, of course, lay authority very uncomfortable with this kind of monasteries. They were so important, so rich, and so they were nationalized. Remember, yesterday I was telling you about Sumitomo being the oldest corporation, founded by a former Buddhist monk. Why former? Because Buddhist monasteries were disbanded in Japan in 16th century, very much like Catholic monasteries in medieval 16th century England. And that kind of distributed the knowledge and resources through the rest of society. So Max Weber was right in pointing us to the importance of religion. He was wrong in pointing to Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. The importance of religion is largely in the very organization of religion. So this is what another very important, great Weberian scholar of today, Michael Mann, calls organizational materialism. So in the study of religion and in the study of ideology in general, we practice organizational materialism. Not just the word of ideas, but how these ideas are integrated into the organizations which tell you this is the right way. And that is very wrong way of doing things. So monasteries are very, very important. So Roman Empire left this legacy which could be easily retrieved by West Europeans. That's one of the reasons, one of the major reasons for the rise of the West. Second reason, of course, is that West Europeans were very lucky with their geography. Mongols did not reach Western Europe because pasturage ends in Hungary, as you probably know. The last piece of open land in Eurasia is actually Hungarian plain, Hungarian puszta. After that, you run into the Alps and into the forests, something that you know from the Lord of the Rings, very nice descriptions of this enormous forest, Mirkwood, because of course Professor Tolkien knew what he was talking about. He was professor of medieval folklore at Oxford. So the two very important advantages: Roman legacy in southwestern Europe, at least all the way to the Rhine River. Second, isolation from the nomads. This is an enormous advantage compared to the Caucasus, compared to us here, compared to the Persians, compared to even to India, and especially to China. They were not under the constant pressure of nomads in medieval times. And then there was the third enormous geographical luck of Europe, as I mentioned again. Two, not one, two defenseless, full of resources continents right across the Atlantic Ocean. The Americas, the North and South America. This was an incredible luck in so many respects for Europeans. First of all, this is where they looted so much silver to pay for their enterprises. This is where they located a lot of their production. Speak of New England, so much of their metalworking, of their lumber, of their food production, of their plantations eventually, and of course such a huge destination for the accident of European demographics. When there were too many poor Scandinavians and poor Germans and poor Englishmen, they could easily go, they could migrate to defenseless continents. Tell this today to the refugees from Afghanistan. So they don't have this luck. Europe had this luck. So when there were a surplus of population, they could go across the ocean. Russia is somewhere in the middle. Russia, of course, did not inherit much from Roman Empire. Russia inherited indirectly through Byzantium, however, and why Russia is Orthodox. Again, so of course, we can go into mental maps of something, but somehow, if we use Occam's razor, the principle of Occam's razor, that we should choose of all the explanations the simplest. The simplest explanation is just look at the map. Dnieper flows into the Black Sea, and Black Sea is where Constantinople was located. Volga flows into the Caspian Sea, and through the Caspian Sea you get to Iran and to the Arab Caliphate. So the peoples of Volga become Islamized, Tatars and so forth. Dnieper, they become Orthodox. And Western Europe, of course, through the rivers and along the coast of Western Europe, they become Catholic in medieval times. That's all pretty straightforward. So Russians are somewhere in the middle. They have monasteries, but the monasteries are not as developed as in Europe. And this will tell you a lot, this will predict for hundreds of years to come something very important about the balance of these civilizations. That Russians have almost European Christianity, but it is not entirely European. Russians inherited from Rome, but not directly. This is both curse, because Russians didn't get much in inheritance compared to France or even Germany, but Russians at the same time are isolated, and this is good. Well, remember what happened to Napoleon Bonaparte? Remember what happened to Hitler? Russia is on an altogether different scale from Western Europe. What happened with Napoleon? Napoleon never carried much in supplies with his army, famously. Right? Because Napoleon was so swift on his marches. Because in Western Europe, the distance on average from town to town is 25 kilometers. So this is one day's march. So they could have another variety of cheese every night as they were conquering Italy. In Russia, the average distance is exactly 10 times more. It's 250 kilometers. And the towns tend to be more like villages, or big villages. So the French starved as they were marching to Moscow, as you probably know, not to mention going back from Moscow. So this is a lack of sorts. Russia is relatively isolated. So Russia is kind of almost in physical terms, not only on the map of world system, it is close, but at the same time distant. In economic terms and in military terms, it is very close to Europe, but at the same time, it can always retreat all the way almost to Volga and Siberia and be safe there. Right, Russia is far enough not only from Germans, but luckily for Russians, Russia or Moscow is far enough from the Turks. Here in Georgia or in the Caucasus, you must appreciate this advantage. What is the distance? So this is why Russia is so big. We'll go to the next one. This is why. I don't know, have you ever seen this picture? All Russian children, of course, know it from textbooks of history. Покорение Сибири Yermakom, the conquest of Siberia by Yermak. See, Russians are shooting their arquebuses. Does it look like, well, if you know much about Latin America, does it look like Pizarro or Cortés? These are conquistadors, arquebuseiros, in Russia they're called strelцы, but they are really arquebuseiros of their time, the soldiers with arquebuses. This is, by the way, a big puzzle. Why Tatars did not adopt firearms on time? And as it often happens with modernization histories, having a history of success, and this is a very general story, having a history of success prevents you from going into the next success, because you're bound to reproduce the past success. Tatars had an elite. Well, by the way, please don't think that all Tatars were horseback warriors and nomads. Majority, maybe 95% of Tatars in the Volga region, think of Volga, around Kazan, they were peasants. They lived in log cabins, just like the Russian peasants. They were very similar to Russian. They still look very much like Russian peasants. Today, when we study DNA, we actually learn that Tatars are almost indistinguishable from Russians in their DNA, the Volga Tatars. But because they lived in the very same similar conditions, they were also agriculturalists, they were plowmen. But there was an elite, a very mobile elite of horseback warriors, people like Tohtamish, Khan Tohtamish, who moved easily from Kazan to Astrakhan, from Astrakhan to Siberia, from Siberia to the Crimean Khanate, because they were warriors at different Tatar courts. And their warrior mentality, their warrior ideology depended on being horseback warriors. They were very good at being horseback. They were not very good at shooting. You know, these arquebuses are not very useful if you are a horseback warrior. They're too heavy. Horseback warrior has a saber and bow and arrows. They're archers. Tatars actually resisted. European knights resisted too, the introduction of firearms, because it was almost obscene. Who are you, a commoner? And you have one of these stinky guns, and you put a neat hole through a knight in shining armor? This is obscene. But of course, it never works against progress, in real life. So Russians, precisely because they were subdued by Tatars in previous ages, Russians adopt firearms very, very rapidly. Okay, story time. Who knows, how did Russians storm Kazan? 1553. They blew up the walls of Kazan. Who was the guy, who was the military expert who conducted the landmines under the walls of Kazan? It was an Englishman whose name was Butler. And that's why the famous Russian family of aristocrats, Butlerovi, they stayed in Russian service. So once they saw the people they could use, they used them. And again, these are Cossacks. Let's stay for a while with this. Cossacks have guns, as you can see. This is very much like Spanish conquistadors in South America. This is why Russia is very comparable to Spain, actually, in many respects. Very early on, they conquer a very large territory. But what did they do? Now let's go to the next one. Well, again, yeah, this is one of great pictures. This is imagination of 19th century artist, not exactly documentary, but this is the English ambassadors evaluate investment opportunities. Ivan the Terrible. As you probably know, the English discovered Russia by chance. They were going, well, because the English were lagging behind, they were going around. They could not go around Africa because the Portuguese did it. They could not go across the Atlantic to the Americas because the Spanish did it already. And the Portuguese and the Spanish were much wealthier and stronger militarily. We're talking about 1550s. So the English decided to sneak their way around Norway, north. And then they thought that if you go north, 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 Norway must end at some point. You turn around, go south, south, and you will hit Persia. They just didn't know Russia existed. So they went all the way around Norway, and then they found a port city. And the port city was actually Christian. It was called Archangels, Arkhangelsk. And they asked, what? Well, we are a port. Yes, we are part of Russia. And there is Moscow, and there is the king. So they traveled, to see the Tsar there. This is the famous story. But this is, again, Russian luck. Remember Poland. Poland was seduced into the world market early on. Poland was seduced to become supplier of raw commodities to the world market and consumer of expensive commodities. Russia could also be, except that it didn't have a common border, except that it was close enough but too far, to be absorbed into the European economy. So let's go to the next one. So what Russians did was, in the 16th century, well, we're coming to this. This is, last time somebody asked me a very important question about civil society. Here it is. This is the Russian civil society. I will explain to you in a moment. The Russian civil society is actually very old. Besides, by the way, it's multi-ethnic, because one of these guys, Prince Pozharsky, is Russian, but the other guy, Kuzma Minin, who is a bourgeois, was ethnically baptized Tatar. So, in this, Russia goes through 3 cycles of modernization. And we will come to this, but first is Ivan the Terrible. He was actually Ivan IV. Peter the Great, or Peter the First. And then, of course, well, who would be the third one? It's a Georgian. I give you a hint. It's a Georgian. Well, yes, it's no denying. Some people say that he was an Ossetian, but today DNA analysis actually shows that Przhevalsky and Stalin shared only the mustache. So he was a Djugashvili. Zugayev, maybe. All right. So, what did Ivan the Terrible borrow? It is the first modernization. He borrowed massively from the best conquerors of the time, which were the Ottoman Turks. He borrowed the Janissaries. You know what is Janissary? Yaniçari. And this means in Turkish, I don't know, somebody must know. Yeah.
New order.
New order. Yeni, new. Yeniçeri, new order infantry. Infantry. This is very important, by the way. I'm going to disclose one terrible thing about the Turks now. I don't know what do you expect from me as an Armenian. But I have a story behind it. At one of the conferences, all these, boring policy conferences in Washington, D.C. Think tanks, State Department guys, and all of them, and speaking about, endemic corruption in the Caucasus, lack of civil society, and blah, 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 and everything. And I could not bear it any longer. It's not me alone, so I stepped outside, and standing in the corridor is a very nice gentleman, and we get into conversation about early Ottomans. I mean, how early? Ottomans in the times of Mongols, when they were actually very badly beaten by the Mongols. As you probably know, it's also, again, typical story of geopolitics. There were two great Turkic nomadic confederacies. I'm not going to call them states. They're really tribal confederacies. Akkoyunlu and Karakoyunlu in our part of the world. The White Sheep and the Black Sheep Confederacy. These are their flags. This is your Didi Turkova. And there was the third, the House of Uthman. Uthman or Ottoman means the sky, the heaven. The third is always, Ivanushka Durachok. The third brother is always the weakest. The third could not match the big two. The big two are always fighting against each other. What the third one is going to do? Trade. And trade, they provided protection to merchants carrying silks on the Silk Road. You heard about the Silk Road. It's a very important smuggling route, because people were carrying silk, and silk is money. They were ambushed and looted all the time, so they needed what, probably you know this Russian, this is mafia jargon, but very important, krysha, kryshyvat. So who provided kryshyvanie, the roof? The roof over the people carrying goods, So this is very much like any sociology of any racketeering. This is quite serious, by the way. I refer to Charles Tilly, the classical work, Coercion, Capital, and European States, from AD 990 until 1992, over the last 1,000 years. Ever heard about this book? Let me just, Charles Tilly. Again, Charles Tilly, Everything by Charles Tilly. The theory of racketeering as the original mode of government. Racketeering, extortion for protection. You pay me so that I don't harm you. I provide protection to you, I provide the roof. So, the House of Ottoman was providing the roof to merchants. And merchants were paying them, which means the House of Ottoman became rich. They were not militarily very glorious, but they were rich. And because they were rich, they were able to attract some of the most ferocious warriors, the Muslim warriors called Ghazi, on their side, and pretend, and later, of course, when you have enough money, so Ottomans are very good capitalists originally. When you have enough money, you can always pay enough historians to produce the histories of your great exploits in the past. That, of course, we were warriors. So if you read Turkish histories, of course, they were terrible, terrible, like Genghis Khan. In fact, it looks like, originally, they were actually mafia, and then they go into business, and they make money, and it all makes a lot of sense. Then typical story, Akkoyunlu and Karakoyunlu exhaust each other. When two behemoths fight, usually who wins is the third. Akkoyunlu and Karakoyunlu exhausted their strength. They fall apart. The Turks, Ottoman Turks, emerge in their stead, and because they have the money, they have the rationality of the money. They immediately realize when they see firearms coming from China, that's it. And firearms require infantry. not cavalry. So they give up on cavalry, they create the Janissaries. Of course, nobody among the good Muslims wanted to be an infantryman. It's too dangerous and it's not glorious. So they had to enlist slaves from among the Christians. There's a problem of how they supplied their Janissaries. But eventually, you cannot really keep in slave condition the people who are doing most of your fighting. Janissaries became the elite of Ottoman state. I asked the man who explained this to me that, wow, this is a very persuasive hypothesis. I never saw that. What can I cite for this? He sighed and I said, you know, this is my PhD dissertation at the University of Chicago, which I never published. I said, but why? Because William McNeill, the famous great William McNeill, told me that I was never going to get a job with this kind of dissertation. So I became United States ambassador in Azerbaijan. That's what I am now. He gave me his card. He's a great scholar, he was. Not the current ambassador. Yeah. The Russians started from the Turks in the beginning. We actually have letters, we have the relations, written mostly by Vlachs, or what today we would call Romanians. Vlachs and Christians from the border side. Romanians, Bulgarians, Serbians, some Greeks who knew the Turks and who were trying to explain to Russians that this is what they do. This is why they are so damn ineffective. They almost restored Eastern Roman Empire. You know, they took already Egypt, they took Mecca, that's it. You know, next they're going to expand against Persia, very classical Roman direction in geopolitics, and west, all the way to Vienna and maybe further on. And the Russian Empire originally is based on Turkish pattern. So Streltsy are really Yanichары, you know, the Janissaries. The Russian pomeshchiki are actually not a feudal class. Feudal class are the people who owned their estates. Pomeshchiki were actually pomestit, you know, they're placed into their villages so that peasants would pay them on condition that pomeshchik serves in the cavalry on his own expense. You must buy your own horse, your own saber. So this is exactly like the Turkish timariot, you know, or the sipahi cavalry, as the Turks called it. You have to have a system of bureaucracy to supply this with taxes. Because basically what Charles Tilly says that before 19th century, before Napoleon Bonaparte, essentially, all European governments had only two ministries, really. Ministry of War and Ministry for the Preparation of War, which otherwise is called Department of Taxation. Collecting taxes means you prepare for the next war, you pay for the previous war, and you prepare for the next war. Because as Colbert, I quoted already Colbert, the great finance minister of Louis XIV, he famously said, sire, he was a source of great quotes. Colbert said, sire, today war requires three things. The first is money. You know this maxim. The second is money. And the third is money. There are three things, and they're all money. You know, nothing for courage, not much even for organization. It's money. It's all about how many guns can you buy. It's a rapid escalation in the cost of war, which comes with firearms. Because firearms are simple to manufacture, they're simple to manage. You need peasants, basically. You know, 2 weeks of boot camp, курс молодого бойца, and they stand in formation and fire at each other. All you need to do is make sure that they don't run, because it's scary, actually. Have you seen, I don't know, Barry Lyndon is a very good film by Stanley Kubrick, which shows you 18th century war very nicely. Or Waterloo by Sergei Bondarchuk or something. So formation against the formation, firing in volleys. And of course, it's very scary. You know, some people get killed, some people, you know, advance with bayonets. So the most important thing is making sure that the soldiers don't run. Therefore, you have officers with pistols and with sabers who kill the deserters who are trying to run back. Заградительный отряд, essentially. What do officers do? What do officers also do? Remember yesterday I asked about who issued the first 200 telescopes in European history. The army of Sweden. during the 30 Years' War. Officers also must be trained to read maps, to have spy glasses, to have clocks or watches, and to have compasses, so that they can use tactics. So this is all coming in one complex of innovation with firearms. William McNeill, do you know the name of William McNeill? The famous, the great William McNeill, who told the future American ambassadors in Azerbaijan not to go into academia. So one more name. Great Scotsman. Was born in October 1917. Died a couple months ago. Царство небесное, великий был человек. So William McNeill, or William Ivanovich as we used to call him because his father was John, so we called him politely William Ivanovich, wrote several great books, and one of them is called Plagues and Peoples. Highly recommended. It's the first study of the role of epidemic disease in human history. We always knew that plagues were present in ancient times, but somebody had to write this systematically. That was William McNeill. We always knew that guns had a role in human history, but William McNeill did it systematically. The book is called The Pursuit of Power, the role of force in human history in the last 1,000 years. The Pursuit of Power. Also available in Russian. Very funny book, I highly recommend it. So once, in Moscow, I get a phone call that somebody, Georgy Matveyevich, somebody very important wants to talk. Who's that? Turns out somebody very important is secretary of one of Russian oligarchs, Potanin. Her boss wanted to get a copy of McNeill's book to give as a gift, and it was completely sold out. So I called the publisher and said, hey, Potanin wants to give your book, and they found it somewhere in a bookshop in Novosibirsk, so they had to send an airplane. Potanin can afford to do that, right? And bring it back there. So William McNeill's The Pursuit of Power. By the way, McNeill also wrote later another very famous book. It takes a genius to recognize that dance is a pervasive practice in human societies. So the book is called Dance and Drill, Keeping Together in Time, Dance and Drill in Human History. We don't know of a single human society which did not dance. Have you ever thought about this? Why do we all dance? Ancient people in caves, they definitely danced. So there is something very important to dance. And dance, by the way, is very intimately related to war, because maneuvering in the field, for parades, first of all, parades is a variety of ballet. If you wish, marching in formation and this kind of militaristic ballet. So what is the role of this? Why do people feel something very special when they dance? They immediately become like this. So McNeill is one of the most important authors, although he did not realize this himself. He just thought that these were funny, interesting episodes in history which he noticed. But these are central explanations of the rise of the West. The Westerners were the first to capitalize on firearms in a very consistent manner. And McNeill explains it best of anyone else. So, when we speak the Westerners, in this case, it's not only what today is the West. In the 16th century, these are the Turks. The Turks are, of course, European power. Turkey belongs in Europe. Turkey is direct inheritor of Roman Empire. By the way, it also shows that it is empirically wrong to claim that there is a conflict between the East and the West, because the Muslim countries are equally inheritors of Roman Empire. They are a different branch from the same root system. There are several branches: Western European branch, the Muslim Middle East branch, and the Russian branch. It went in several directions. So Russians first borrow from the Turks everything. Prikaz system, which is divan in Turkey, janissaries, the cavalry of the Sipah, which is the Russian помещики. Then Russia goes through another modernization cycle, which is Peter the Great, and Peter the Great is about all those officers with spy glasses. Remember, I told you, that Sweden was the first country to introduce Why Sweden? Because Swedes, look at the map again. Swedes are in Scandinavia. This is pretty far away from centers of Europe, of Western Europe. Swedes did not have much of a comparative advantage in any market. The only way they could be relevant was by becoming militarily strong. They are the original mercenary nation. They were the mercenaries and the military industrial complex. They produced guns for the Netherlands. Remember the Dutch merchants who pay Rembrandt to paint them as warriors? They are paying Swedes at the very same time to do their fighting. That's why Volvo to this day and Saab, you realize that Saab is military industrial complex of the country which hasn't fought a war in 200 years now. But Sweden used to be very militaristic. And the second Russian teacher was Sweden, as you know. Again, you know the story, probably people usually remember it best, this kind of funny episodes. When Peter the Great defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War, 1721, the Peace of Neustadt, Russians celebrated with a big banquet. At this banquet, the prisoner Swedish admirals and generals were seated to the right hand of the Tsar. He poured his glass of wine, he raised it, and the first toast, remember, was to our teachers, to the Swedes. Russians themselves do not understand how much do they owe to Sweden. I mean, with very basic words, those of you who know Russian, what is the Russian for herring? Fish. Selotka, seld. And Swedish, sild. The Russian for, the Swedish for shrimps, krevetki, rak. And I can go on and on. It's amazing. One of my Swedish graduate students once was explaining, that, oh, professor, we have this card game, only Swedes play it. It explains so much about Swedish mentality. This is how we really think. We play this very complicated game of cards. It's called preference. Only Swedes. I think yes, so prisoners, Swedish prisoners brought it into Russian Empire. And of course, Russian Empire of the 18th century, it has the Dutch flag. To this day, the Russian flag is a modified version of the Dutch flag. The name St. Petersburg is the Dutch name, but the whole system, gubernia, the table of ranks. Do you understand what is table of ranks? Tabel o rangach. 14 ranks, which structures state service. Somebody asked me yesterday about the middle class. That's it. That's what happens with the middle class. The middle class is invited into the table of ranks. And if you don't fit, sorry. Утро стрелецкой казни, this probably very famous painting, the morning of the execution of Streltsy. This is very important. Peter the Great executed the Streltsy. And the Streltsy were not medieval remnant. The Streltsy were the remnant of the previous modernization of Russia, of Ivan IV. Very much the same would be when Stalin will be executing the nobility of Russian Empire. It's the same cycle. First you destroy the nobility of previous modernization cycle because they're not your people, and then you form your own new nobility, nomenclatura, or in this case, the nobility of Russian state. So we could go to the next one. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, to the previous one. I have to explain, to the civil society. Of course, you know that now the 4th of November is official holiday in Russia, the day of reconciliation. They need something very much like you in Georgia. You struggle also, with Soviet past, trying to expunge it, so make sure that people do not celebrate Soviet holidays, that they forget, these great parades on the 7th of November. So under Putin in Russia, they introduced the 4th of November. The 4th of November is presumably the day when Russians dislodged Polish occupying garrison from the Kremlin in 1612. It's actually very important because how did the first cycle, and each cycle ends in the defeat, and that's why Russians are so successful. After Ivan the Terrible, he dies, as you probably know. He killed his son. He had another son who was weak-minded. Rurik dynasty is extinguished in Russia. They get into time of trouble. So this is the traditional explanation. More persuasive, at least to me and my materialistic mind, is the explanation that what happened with Russia is that the state grew so strong, so fast, that they could not stop expropriating their peasants. They took too much from the peasants because they could. That's why they took it. They needed resources, and they took the resources. And then, as you probably know, the exotic story, a volcano blew up in Peru with a very long name in 1600 exactly, and that eruption was so big that a lot of soot, a lot of ashes were thrown into upper atmosphere, and that produces global cooling for several years, global winter of sorts. And it began snowing in Russia in 1600, exactly 1600. It began snowing in late August in Russia. And crops failed. And peasants had only just barely enough for 1 year. So the first year, they endured. But normally, peasants in this kind of societies must have at least 3 years worth of supply of grain. Because it could be, what if the bad year happens, bad harvest happens not once, but twice in a row? Because it can happen, maybe even 3 times in a row. It happened actually 5 years in a row because of that volcano. Russia lost probably half of its population. It was, why I mentioned these numbers, because today we kind of don't appreciate where we live. You know, that we live in a totally different world. You know, that our troubles, of course, are not even comparable to the troubles of our ancestors. So after that, Russia is plundered. You know, it becomes rudderless. It has no ruler. It's a big country which is open to foreign incursions. And there are incursions by Ukrainians, or we call them Cossacks at the time, the Bolotnikov army, and the Poles and Swedes, Swedish mercenaries. Eventually, you know, they take over the Kremlin and Moscow. This is, they impose the dynasty of false Dmitry, Lzhet Dmitry. And of course, because this is still a failed state, it looks very much like Somalia or Afghanistan today. There are groups of bandits roaming the country all over the place. So in Nizhny Novgorod, one of the local bazaris, he was a butcher called Kuzma Minin, finds an unemployed officer from the old army, because the army had collapsed. So this is, I don't know, it's like Georgia in 1992, something like this. You know, so the army had collapsed, and there is this guy who used to be a general in the old army, but now he has no army, Prince Pozharsky. So the guy with meat cleaver offers him and to the guy with the sword that, hey, we pay you. We will collect money from the all local bazaars, from the merchants, and you create a local vigilante, you know, private security force to patrol around our city. And then they realized that merchants in Yaroslavl, in other big cities on the Volga River, are doing the same. They're pulling together resources, and they're paying some kind of private protection force, some kind of warlords, to protect at least the city. And then the next is logical step, okay, let's unite our efforts, Yaroslavl with Nizhny Novgorod. You are paying your forces, we are paying our forces. Somebody needs to give this a blessing. The church immediately gives this a blessing. So they go on Moscow, and then they realize that the ultimate evil is in Moscow. Let's take control over the center, impose a new government. This is actually how Russia emerged out of time of trouble. But this is also something very important. You know, why I'm telling you this story in detail? Because inshallah, if all goes well, something like this might happen in Iraq today. You know, this also explains to you probably what is the function of the Taliban in Afghanistan. So what they're doing, you know, whose support do they get in that part of the world? Now, this is also very important because in this time, Russians came in contact with West European armies which were just about 1 generation ahead of them. Swedes and to some extent Poles, but mostly Swedes. There were even Spanish conquistadors there because they were just mercenaries, you know, floating around Europe. And in early 1600s, they made it to Russia. Russians were humiliated, and it's very useful in modernization to be humiliated, to know that you are weak. As Peter the Great later said, defeated armies are quick learners. Разбитые армии хорошо учатся. And so Russians were humiliated, but not extinguished. So their luck was, and this is what is not told in Russian standard history textbooks, Poland and Sweden got very busy very soon with the 30 years war between Protestants and Catholics in Europe. So им было не до России. So they just forgot about Russia. And Russians, they watched that, the horror story. The foreigners just remembered, like in Japan, Commodore Perry. They came, they showed the strength of their arm, and they left. What remains? So let's go to the next one. What remains is, yes, thank you, to emulate from the West. Now, so the first emulation was from the Turks, the second from the West, Peter the Great, but they actually start before Peter the Great. Speaking of civil society, I did not forget entirely about civil society because the cycle goes like this. In the beginning of the cycle, you have a very strong man, some kind of Ivan the Terrible or Stalin, somebody who uses force to wrestle resources from the elites and kill and chop the elites in part. Then, once the resources are gathered, they are thrown into building a new army. Then the new army goes on conquest and Russia becomes big and great. Siberia is conquered, or with Peter the Great, he conquers the Baltic. Catherine will conquer Ukraine and something like that. Next, what do they do next? What everyone does after success. You rest. You rest on laurels. So next is that we are champions, we are the champions of the world, great, and next come very good decades. This is kind of Brezhnev time stagnation, only in the 17th century. Good, the time to relax. And when you start relaxing, immediately Demon intelligentsia emerges. This is when your civil society strikes back. And the first Russian dissidents are, as you probably know, Andrei Kurbsky, prince who ran to Lithuania and was writing, the famous correspondence between Kurbsky and Ivan the Terrible. And this is, there are two. One is saying that you became not liberal and not Western enough. You must be more Western. You must be more like Lithuania because Lithuania is advanced, it's democratic, it's in Europe. And on the other hand, there is Protopop Avakum, the founder of this Old Believers Russian church, saying that this is an abomination. You are forgetting about the laws of our ancestors. We must go back, not ahead in time. We must be loyal to the old religion and so forth. So either go ahead or go back. Почвенники, the people, the fundamentalists, or the westernizers. Next one. I explained already about Peter the Great. One mystery only about Peter the Great. He had Georgians. And he had Armenians, of course, Bagrationi and others. My favorite story, I forgot the name. Who was, this is so evocative about the Georgians. That Peter had one of his generals who was a Georgian, decorated, for fighting against the Swedes in Finland. At the very same day, the brother of that Georgian was decorated by the Shah of Iran, of Persia, for the beautiful defense of Kandahar, which he conducted on behalf of. So two brothers, both from Tiflis, one or somewhere around Tiflis. One of them decorated on the same day for fighting in Finland, and the other for fighting in Afghanistan. These are Georgians. Yeah, the Georgian elites globalization. But I forgot what was the name of the... So you can figure out who that was. Of course, this is no... it's not by coincidence that there is Большая Грузинская and Малая Грузинская in Moscow, that there are so many Georgians. By the way, also why Americans call the white people Caucasian? Since 1962, who are the Caucasians? It's you. It's you. Yeah, because that guy, he was Swiss-German anthropologist, Blumenbach. He was in, well, there are two versions of the story. The morbid version is that he was in love with the skull of a girl because he measured skulls. And the kind of, I prefer the story that he was in love with the Russian princess who actually was a Georgian, and being a good Georgian, she really was a Circassian. Something so. So he called, that was in the 1830s or 1820s. So he called the epitome of white race Caucasian. And since then, we're stuck with that. So we are Caucasians, but you cannot say that in the West because it's politically incorrect. No, so you realize. So Peter the Great is actually quite an amazing despot. The really incredible thing about him is why he was not killed. And for this, remember I told you about Dmitry Furman. You have to read Dmitry Furman. That's in Russian. We are working on translation, but Furman, Dmitry Efimovich Furman, the Russian aristocrat with Jewish stepfather, and that's why Dmitry Efimovich Furman as the name. Dmitry Efimovich explains the incredible thing that Peter the Great did not go Catholic. It's actually from being Orthodox, it's very difficult to go Catholic. Peter the Great became Protestant. And Russia essentially became a Protestant country in organization, not in the church doctrine, unfortunately, because church doctrine, then you would have liberal universities eventually and blah, blah, blah. But in the organization, it's a holy synod. There was no patriarch any longer in Russian Empire. And not a pip. Well, there was some minor rebellion, but Peter the Great actually survived. And the second incredible thing about Peter the Great is that St. Petersburg was not abandoned after his death. Who wanted to live in that swamp? The elites, the new middle class which he had created. Because without that swamp city, what would be all these men who now shaved and who wore wigs and who spoke Dutch and drank beer and smoked pipes and received government subsidies? So there was a new elite. Let's go to the next one. And that's the problem. The problem with all elites is that eventually they become top-heavy. In the beginning, of course, this is Lord of the Rings story. In the beginning, everything is great, because people are very vigorous, because people are prepared to fight, and because just pure demographics. There are not very many of them. But elites, that's the definition of elites. Elites have more resources than peasants. More children survive. Elites want to reproduce, and lots of other people like Mikhail Lomonosov, son of a fisherman, as you probably know, make it into, by some cunning plot, they make it into the elites. And then they also imported how many Germans? Right, the famous story when Prince Yusupov, when Nicholas I, Russian Tsar, wanted to promote Prince Yusupov and asked him, that's 1830s, for his fighting in the Caucasus. Yusupov, what order do you want from me? And Yusupov, what did he answer? Real story. Your Majesty, could you please promote me into Germans? Kind of the highest order of Russian Empire is being a German. Don't give me a medal, make me a German. And then Yusupov, of course, is a Russified Tatar name from Yusup. So, Russian Empire acquires too many noblemen. Now you already know that having lots of noblemen and noble women means that you are going to have beautiful culture. Georgians are a bigger example than Russians themselves in this respect. This means that you are going to have very good manners in society. This means that you are going to have very rambunctious politics, because not everyone can make it into the elite. There are lots of people who have pretension to be elites, and there are not enough positions which pay enough to behave like elites, which means that there will be a lot of competition. This is not me, this is Jack Goldstone actually explaining the English Revolution of 1640, that there were about 3 times as many elites in England than there were positions for elites. So lots of them become counter-elites. They become revolutionary elites, they become writers, they become publishers, they become businessmen sometimes. So in Russian Empire, this problem was experienced very acutely. especially in the Caucasus, by the way. Let me give you just one example. When the Russian Empire gave land, ended serfdom, I know about the North Caucasus in Kuban, Cossack host. In the war officially, the Caucasus War ended in 1867. Сословно-поземельная комиссия gave land to everybody. The population of the province was 150,000. In 1913, the population was 1.5 million. It's exactly 10 times. I hear that some similar demographic trends occur in Guria, which explains to you in Guria and in Samegrelo, which explains to you why these places are so rambunctious and so many peasant revolts, which today probably don't make sense to a lot of you, to a lot of people living there. Because there were so many Georgian nobles, or actually claiming to be nobles, that to minimally provide them with any kind of estates, as you probably know, peasants had to be liberated without any land at all in Western Georgia, you know, that they got just their freedom and obligations to the princes. Now you can also imagine what happens if the peasants who are liberated without land happen to be ethnic Ossetian, and their lord happens to be a Georgian from somewhere in Gori. I'm saying in Gori because I know specifically such stories, right? You know, so today we would have a recollection of these as ethnic conflict, while it was actually demographic and classical agrarian conflict in the 19th century. So Russian Empire is running into this big problem. On the one hand, as of 1900, Russian Empire is successful. Please don't fall under the charm of Bolshevik propaganda, saying that, or even more, you know, some SR and others, that Russia was backward. Russia was backward compared to England. Sorry, but how many countries really compared to England in 1900? Did India compare to England? You know, compare Russia to the peers in 1500. So when they all began with firearms, the rise of to modernity, Russia was in the shadow. Russia was a dwarf compared to China, India, even Burma. But in 1900, where is Burma and where is Russia? Where is Spain even in 1900? Where is Italy in 1900? Russia is still a great power. Russia has some very good science. It has Mendeleev and Butlerov, for that matter, but not much capacity to produce based on that science. So a typical story which will be reproduced again in the 1970s, 1980s. Great inventors, and still today. We have great scholars. We don't have production which can commercialize on that scholarship. So lots of people start thinking that something has to be done. And who is the strongest guy in the realm? It's the Tsar, it's the state. So the state has to do something. We cannot rely just on the commercial elites, on bourgeoisie. And then, you know, just don't believe, you know, that Russian Empire was entirely defenseless and senile. They had geniuses. Of these three, of course, you know Witte, you know Stolypin. But do you know Durnovo? Please look up Durnovo. Okay, another story time. I teach Steve Kotkin's book, Biography of Stalin, to my students in Abu Dhabi. And among my students in Abu Dhabi, there are several who belong to the royal families. Well, we are a monarchy, we're absolute monarchy over there, so there are a few kids who are from the royal households. They are princesses and princes, literally. And it's kind of funny, you know, explaining, of course, about revolution and what happened to the Russian imperial family. So I ask my students, you know, so what did you learn about Stalin and the Bolsheviks? I said, professor, the most important lesson we learned was Durnovo, chief of police. This is the chief of police which subdued the revolution of 1905. He was genius of police business. He left, you know, on the internet, please look up, there is a huge controversy whether it is a fake or real document, but Durnovo, who had died before 1917, Durnovo left the famous memorandum to the Tsar, warning him what would happen if Russia enters World War I. And he predicted almost step by step everything that was going to happen. So Durnovo was, if he ever wrote that, he was super genius, you know, most farsighted. And then, as it often happens, you know, the people who are most farsighted, don't worry, make some noise if you need to leave. Goodbye. Sorry. Durnovo, Stolypin, and Witte were ultra-reactionaries. They were not liberals. It often happens so that the best analysis is from either far right or far left. Why? Because these are the people who are not invested in the regime, who don't wear the blinders of the regime. They were far right. They really were warning the Tsar, that if you continue with this State Duma, if you continue without reform of the... So Stolypin basically was suggesting fascism from above. Create a reactionary, rich peasant class which would be opposed to proletariats and poor peasants. And that could have worked, except that, well, again, go to Bob Allen, who analyzed Stolypin's reforms and shows that Stolypin was banking on very expensive Russian exports of grain. The problem is that in the 1920s, look what happened with Argentina. The countries which specialized in bulk exports of commodities went nosedive. What happened to Australia? What happened to Argentina? These are classical stories, or even Canada, to some extent, suffered a lot. But Argentina is the classic, because Argentina used to have per capita GDP more than Southern Europe. Because not very many people in 1900 Argentina, and a lot of cows, and with refrigeration plants, Argentina became a major supplier of beef to European markets. And then the beef prices were going down the whole 20th century. And Argentina today is only about 60% of Italian GDP per capita, right? So this is same story with Australia. Australia was far above. They looked like oil states of today. Small population, lots of resources, export-oriented resources. The problem with that export is that it's dependent on one single commodity. And you don't control the price of that commodity. So this was the vulnerability of Stolypin and these reformers. So there were geniuses in the Russian Empire, but they could not prevent the revolution. So let's... Well, yes, exactly, because of the political barrier. And the true inheritor to all three of them is this gentleman. In 1930 or 31, Georgy Fedotov is a close friend of Berdyaev, a Russian religious thinker living in Paris at the time, writes that we expected that Stalin would be infernal devil. Well, of course, he's writing before 1937. So we expected that Stalin would be something out of this world. He turned out to be a railway man. He builds railways. He's obsessed with tractor factories, primarily. So Stalin took up the standard German modernization program, which was pursued by Witte and Stolypin, largely. Only Stolypin understood, that he wanted rural-based, commodity-producing and conservative by giving land to big peasants, to kulak. Stalin wanted the rural base, conservative, by consolidating peasants into collective farms, into kolkhoz. So this is kind of unwritten story, not the change, because in Soviet times, the Soviet ideologists, but also the anti-communists, everybody stressed the discontinuity, how different the Bolsheviks are from the Tsarist empire. Both the whites, of course, the emigres were saying that no, this is not at all like the Tsarist empire. Some, like Georgy Fedotov, who were very far-sighted, so that no, it's actually very much the same. It's very continuous. And it is a big story which remains to be written. Just how much continuity there was with the Tsarist regime. Let's go to the next one. But there was one very big discontinuity. And this is my favorite, why I wrote this in such very big letters. Stephen Hansen, in his book Time and Revolution, wrote that the Bolsheviks created something, the kind of power Max Weber himself could not have imagined, a charismatic bureaucracy. The party, which was organized like German army, but had the ideology of Marxism, was very inspiring as a party. I don't know, do we have, very briefly, how did the Bolsheviks win the Civil War? Let me ask you another, вопрос на засыпку. Anyone knows what is the first republic, ethnic republic in the Russian Federation? So it's Russian Federation, right? So there is Russia, and then there is Dagestan, there is Tatarstan. What was the first? How come you know? Rezo, you know everything, yeah. Bashkiria. Bashkiria was the first. Why? Because in the beginning, the Bolsheviks did not know what they were doing, like any good revolutionaries. But they were very opportunistic. This is, if there are any revolutionaries here, I'm giving out the recipe of how to be successful. So you have to be very opportunistic. In the beginning, so what is the first country to gain independence from Russian Empire? Finland. In December 1917, 1 month, a couple of weeks really after the Bolshevik Revolution, delegation from Finland comes to Lenin and explains that, well, we're Finland and we want to say, of course. Lenin's first instinct was very socialist. If you want independence, you must have it. Georgia, Armenia, everybody, Ukraine, you can have your independence. Because this is what we promised as socialists. But then, within another month, Finland becomes an anti-communist base. Estonia becomes the rear base for Yudenich army. And they reconsider this, well, maybe not. This time, and in winter 1918, Ataman Dutov Cossacks are marching from Siberia, from southern Urals to Moscow, and the Bolsheviks are desperate. The country is big. They don't have forces anywhere. The country is very big. So between the Volga and the Urals, there was nobody except a few trains with Bashkir soldiers returning from the World War I. So the Bolsheviks go to the soldiers and promise to them, guys, anything. You want to have your republic? Here is your republic. You want to have your Academy of Sciences? There will be a Bashkir Academy of Sciences for you. We will create Bashkir cinema studio for you. Anything, there will be modernization for the Bashkir people. Fight for us. Because with Dutov, with Ataman Dutov, you know what is going to happen. You will be back in Russian Empire. With us, you have a chance in the future. This is your charismatic bureaucracy. And then something is, you probably know, I don't know, is it offense to mention Sandro from Chegem stories in Georgia? When Uncle Sandro meets the Bolsheviks in Abkhazia first, and he goes back and says, these people are not Mensheviks. So if you know these stories, they're great Abkhaz, well, they're Russian language, they're really not Abkhaz stories. But they're about Abkhazia, about Uncle Sandro, who first meets, the Georgian Mensheviks who built an armored personnel carrier of wood. Said it's a joke, and then he goes, meets the Bolsheviks, and the first thing that the Bolshevik commissar, who was just shaving before a piece of mirror attached to a tree, looks at him and said, shoot him immediately. And Uncle Sandro, with great difficulty, remember, now he escapes, he swims across the river, comes back to his Abkhaz village and says, I saw them. They're very serious people. This is your bureaucracy also. The real life story would be actually about Comrade Ordzhonikidze and Comrade Kirov, who in 1918, when the 11th Army was destroyed, and that's why, so you probably know that 11th Army is the Red Army which invaded Georgia in 1921, right? But you know that it'd been in Georgia in 1918 too. Do you know this? The 11th Army was destroyed originally by the Denikin forces, by the whites in the North Caucasus, in Vladikavkaz. And they walked across on the military Georgian road. They walked to Georgia. They were disarmed and arrested and interned by the Georgian authorities. And then Georgian authorities, expecting that Denikin was winning the war, sent them back to Russia, where they were all executed by the whites. This is something that the Bolsheviks actually, this is the big grudge. When they stopped regarding the Georgian Mensheviks as comrades, because they were in the same party after all, right? You realize that. That the first country with social democratic government is here. In the meantime, Ordzhonikidze and Kirov escaped to the Ingush villages, where, of course, the Ingush asked them, who are you? They said, we are Marxists. Marxist is what? Said Marxists is, and then there must have been a very fascinating debate for probably 2 weeks, lasting almost 2 weeks, comparing the teaching of Karl Marx to the teaching of Prophet Muhammad, point by point. In the end of this debate, the ulema of Chechen and Ingush villages concluded, they issued the famous fatwa. The fatwa stated, that the 5th Workers' Peasant Regiment under the command of Comrade Nikolai Gikalo is the army of jihad. And this is when the famous the green-red coalition appeared in the North Caucasus. And of course, green doesn't mean at all that they were environmentalists. You realize that the green-red coalition struck the white forces in the back. So Bolsheviks actually won by building alliances. In Ukraine, everywhere, very inspiring alliances. The Bolsheviks had this very inspiring ideology, but could we go to the next one? But the Bolsheviks were actually learning also, so they were very much realistic people, because those who were not realistic, they disappeared, like Trotsky, into exile. They were shot, like Prosyan or others. Prosyan was an Armenian left socialist, SR, and others. The realists remained. And the realists were the people learning from other Germans. And these 3 Germans, they knew very well. Because in the leadership of Bolsheviks, actually, who did not read German language? Probably only Stalin. Everybody knew German. They were very Germanophile. And they learned, well, this is direct line to the Soviet industrialization. And of course, they were also enamored with the most Germanic of American businessmen, which was Henry Ford. The story is that in 1930, how did the collectivization happen? Henry Ford had built 2 tractor factories in Detroit, or near Detroit, which stood idle from the beginning because of the Great Depression. Farmers did not have money to buy the tractors. So the Soviet Union decided to buy those tractors. But nobody would sell to the Soviet Union because these guys do not honor their credit lines. You know what they did to the Tsarist debt. They repudiated it. So these are this is a rock state. The Soviet Union had to pay with cash. The only way, well, they tried to sell some Rembrandts. Armand Hammer bought a few, but that was not enough. They tried to sell crown jewels, literally. That led to a scandal, actually, when Queen of England recognized some of the jewels of Russian royal family at a ball, and that ended in a big high society scandal. So they decided to sell what Russia was always selling, exporting, grain. Grain had to be seized from peasants, massively. That provoked enormous starvation among the peasants. Remember Ivan the Terrible? Again, why they did this? Because first of all, they could. They captured grain from peasants. That provoked, of course, Holodomor in Ukraine. The problem with Ukrainian ideology is that, of course, Yushchenko was using this as only a Ukrainian charge against the communists. But what, the heaviest casualties of collectivization were actually in which republic? Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, 40% died out. Because they were maybe more, because Kazakhs were nomadic still at that time. Kazakhs slaughtered a lot of their cattle, and the first winter, there was something horrible happening there. Also in the Volga region, in the North Caucasus, Kuban, Don, the Bolsheviks desperately needed cash. And they were not thinking, they were not ignorant about market operations. By the way, when we look today into the way they discuss in Politburo their experts, it's actually remarkable how much they knew about gold standard and the operations of currency boards. It's remarkable, they were, well, people like Dzerzhinsky, who had spent many years in prison, they were reading books there. But of course, there are also the people like Dzerzhinsky. They come from prison and from civil war, and they are ready to shoot because they were ready themselves to die. So Dzerzhinsky, look, what happens in 1929? Very simple thing. The peasants do not want to sell their grain at the artificially lower prices offered by the state. So what could be easier than raising the prices? Pay the peasants what they want, because you will be paying in the Soviet rubles, which is paper. You will print more of those rubles. So you pay them in August. By December, you provoke inflation like 30%, 40%. You can live with that, and it will wipe out all the peasant savings. But the problem would be that you are also damaging the exchange rate of the ruble. So you will not be able to import technology from the West at the same advantageous terms that you are trying to get. You are trying to get as much technology as you can. So why I'm going into all these details? I'm trying to explain to you that there was a rationality behind all that madness. Dzerzhinsky says that very well, we cannot go with inflation. What can we do? This is before 29, Dzerzhinsky had died earlier, but this is one of the Politburo sessions where Dzerzhinsky, and by the way, by the end of his life, you realize he was not in charge of ČK. He was in charge of Ministry of Economy. He was an economist in that government. Like Che Guevara was economist for the Cuban government. So Dzerzhinsky says, very well, we cannot afford to unleash inflation. So what are we going to do? We are going to put very stringent limitations on currency exchange. And of course, then there will be a black market of currency exchanges, right? What do you expect? And Dzerzhinsky simply said that then I will simply execute 10,000 speculators in the streets so that people would be taught a lesson. So this is Dzerzhinsky. This is a typical Bolshevik attitude, that they understand how things work, but mass executions are perfectly within the repertoire of their action. They are charismatic bureaucracy. They are waging war. So they buy 2 factories from Henry Ford, and of course those 2 factories, this is the future Kharkov tractor factory and Stalingrad tractor factory. And of course those tractor factory can manufacture tanks, the famous T-34, T-34. And it is apocryphal story. I cannot confirm it, but FBI tells just elected President Roosevelt, and President Roosevelt was the first, immediately, one of the first acts of him after inauguration in 1932 was diplomatic recognition of the USSR. He immediately establishes diplomatic relations. So he gets the information that the Soviets are buying dual-purpose technology from Henry Ford. And his reaction was, I don't care about the tanks which are produced in Siberia. They cannot roll into the streets of New York, but they can into the streets of Berlin. And of course, 1932 is the time when Adolf Hitler is coming to power. So let's go to the next one. The Soviets are infatuated with everything American. If you ever seen the building of State Duma in Moscow, it's the former building of Gosplan. This is my favorite. If you ever been to Chicago, well, Johannes, you recognize the building, yeah. And you recognize the building. Yeah. This is Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I mean, they copy it almost exactly. They love this kind of, what we could call today many of the Stalinka. You have to go to America to see what they do. Evanston, actually. They copy not only that. This is one of the best. Okay, so soon it will be, I don't know, supper time. To whet your appetite. It's a wonderful book by the wife, by the way, Irina Glushenko is the wife of Boris Kagarlitsky, about Общепит and Mikoyan. So Stalin and his crew, the Bolsheviks, created this new enormous industry. This means that now people have lunch break. And during the lunch break, the Soviets have to feed hundreds of thousands of workers and engineers within very short period of time, but they are all about something scientific and scientifically. And then Stalin looks around the table and says, and preferably tasteful too. He looked at Kaganovich, and Kaganovich said, I will be in charge of food supplies. I said, Kaganovich, you will be in charge of railways. You are Jewish, and in charge of food supplies will be Mikoyan, because in the Caucasus, all the best dukhans are run by Armenians. So this is apocryphal, and Mikoyan, who of course, Mikoyan never ran any dukhan in his life, but this is kind of Stalin stereotypical thinking, that it has to be an Armenian, running the food supplies. So Mikoyan goes actually to United States with a lot of currency. He met personally Henry Ford, and I don't know if any of these Soviet-style stolovaya survived in Georgia. They must have, where you have 3 metal rails. You take a tray, you open, IKEA is like that. You open the transparent plastic door. This is Henry Ford. Remember, Henry Ford, who is parodied by Charlie Chaplin in modern times. Remember that machine that force-feed the worker during the... So this is all modernity. This is all modernization. So what did Mikoyan bring back from America? Canned peas, mayonnaise, plombier. So how can you imagine Soviet Salat Olivier or Soviet New Year celebration without all these American ingredients? And this is also the totalitarian command economy at its best or worst. When she describes a wonderful story when Mikoyan comes to Stalin's office and says, "Comrade Stalin, we have these 3 pieces of soap. We have to select one because we cannot produce all of them. We're too poor. One of the soaps will become the standard Soviet soap, and we have to," and he starts sniffing, sniff them, понюхайте. So, and Stalin said, no, this is very important. We cannot do this keleyna, just 2 of us. So he opens the door and says, "Molotov, please come in. We will create a committee." 3 people is already a committee. So they sniff soap bars, they select one, and they say, okay, this is going to be banное мыло number 1, for the Soviet Union. And they produce, of course, millions and millions of them. This is how they produce Kniga o vkusной и здоровой пище, the book of healthy and tasty food. This is how they ordered the creation of Soviet Shampanskoye. And this is, of course, the way that Georgians colonized the Soviet Union, mentally. The rest of it, because lobby, khachapuri, khinkali, it kind of spreads all over the Soviet Union. This is the chronology of Soviet totalitarianism. There is one thing which I cannot explain. There is the standard explanation that Stalin in 1937 unleashed his mass campaign of purges because of the civil war in Spain. Stalin remembered how he himself came to power in the wake of military defeat of Russian Empire in 1917. Stalin and Lenin, of course, Stalin realized that they were fifth columnists, essentially, right? They were traitors to their empire. So Stalin realized that this is exactly what can happen to him. This is probably the best explanation I ever heard, but Stephen Kotkin says that no, probably doesn't work, but then what? We don't know. So Kotkin tells me that this is more like the German pilot who slammed his Airbus into the mountain, killing all people aboard. But I have a general sociological explanation. Why did Stalin do this? This is not the question. The question should be, why was he able of doing this? He had the state where his manias in his head, and Stalin is an incredible guy. Imagine, that he starts his life, again, I'm quoting Dmitry Furman. He has, during Perestroika, Dmitry Efimовich Furman wrote a study of Stalin as a new religion. Said, a lot of things fall in place if we consider this a religion. It's a religion, and it follows a religious trajectory, a typical. In the beginning, there is a very charismatic underground cult. The Bolsheviks are a cult. And this cult, Stalin represents catacomb Christian, persecuted by Roman Empire. In his lifetime, he becomes a Grand Inquisitor. And he lives even longer, and in the end of his life, he becomes a Renaissance Pope, building these enormous temples and buildings, like beautifying Vatican, his Vatican. So there, and then the trajectory actually continues. So I think the most important part is not 1937, because before 1937, you can see that the system is he's tightening the bolts, закручивает гайки. He is going up and up and up. Why did he do 1937? Because he could. Because he decided to eliminate even potential opposition. Anybody who might disagree with him, anybody who even ever remembered him as being something else in his lifetime. Stalin, by the way, was changing inevitably, so I think it would be very wrong, well, let's put it this way, that if somebody could go back in 1908 or 09 and tell Stalin what he would become in 37, Stalin probably would be very surprised. It would be actually very interesting, to see what would be his reaction to such a prophecy. So it was totally improbable, but if not for World War I, if not for Lenin and his political genius, making alliances with this and that part, promising to everyone whatever they wanted to hear from the Bolsheviks, but also delivering. They built those national republics. They built the industries everywhere. And they built Germanic discipline after all. Stalin perceived himself as the great continuator of Lenin. So that's a good question, did he really consider himself a Georgian? He probably didn't. But he was not a Russian nationalist either, he was a communist. He was really pushing for the world revolution, but he was, unlike, this topsy-turvy, very unstable flip-flopper, narcissistic Trotsky, unlike the drunkard Rykov, unlike Bukharin, who was just talkative, and unable to concentrate, the intriguers, inveterate intriguers, Kamenev and Zinoviev. Stalin was the one workaholic on the Politburo. This is the guy who worked long hours. This is where Stephen Kotkin is actually very persuasive. This is the guy who really considered himself to be the practical doer. He was a bureaucrat, really a bureaucrat, but he was a very, very workaholic bureaucrat. American corporations would love to have such people. This is what actually they cultivate, the people who are flaming up with the projects. And he considers himself to be the realist communist, that we are building an empire because empire can protect the idea. Whatever it takes to protect the idea and to spread it. And he's quite successful with that until 1941. Again, in 1941, I asked Kotkin, hey, but he almost lost the war with all his repression. To which Kotkin, this is a funny situation because we're sitting in Vienna, Café Central, at the very same table where Trotsky used to have his coffee. So Kotkin said, well, do you realize that the Wehrmacht sent into the Soviet Union 4.2 million? It was the biggest army of invasion ever in human history. And they barely crawled on their bellies to Moscow. This is quite a feat. This is quite incredible, what they managed to do there. And what is the most important part, Adolf Hitler, again, Fuhrmann, I'm always telling you, Fuhrmann was dying from multiple sclerosis. In the last year of his life, Dmitry Yefimovich Fuhrmann was not able to move his legs first. You know what happens with multiple sclerosis. Then his arms. He was typing with one finger. Eventually, so when I visited him, he could barely swallow. He would say, okay, Starik, pour some vodka into... He asked me to pour vodka into his throat. I said, because it's okay. I'm finished. Now I can drink, but I cannot leave the glass. So pour vodka into my throat, and let's have an interesting conversation. Something like non-standard, So this is how great people die. Said, what Stalin had in common with Hitler is right on the surface. It's not interesting. What was different? Let's talk about, what was different between the two guys. And there are very important things which were different. Hitler killed, he's responsible for killing lots of people. He didn't kill his fellow Nazis, except Rome and in the very beginning. And in the very end, but those were not Nazis, they were German officers who were really plotting against him. But he killed lots of people outside the party. Stalin was actually obsessed with purity of his own party. Hitler was anti-bureaucratic. Hitler heard voices. Hitler was actually the desperation of German bureaucracy, because he was telling, that he heard voices, he believed in his willpower, he was telling the German bureaucrats and military planners that they have to do this, because he believes this is doable. Stalin in 1942 actually stopped interfering with the military. It's actually something very incredible, that Stalin, during the Battle of Stalingrad, he stepped back. He was so scared, because things were going very badly for the Soviet Union. He allowed Zhukov, well, just one thing, which he always preserved, his final prerogative, is to allow several voices to be heard from among his military command. What will Comrade Zhukov say? What would Comrade Rokossovsky say to that? But then, guys, it's between you. You are the military, so you have to decide this. This is very wise policy. But this is destruction of totalitarian state. Stalin himself built the state, and he had to start disassembling it. And basically what we see ever since then is the disassembly of the Soviet totalitarian state from the top. Because once Stalin, by the way, again, those of you who are old enough to remember Communist Party history, Stalin stopped convening party congresses in 1938. For 14 years, until 1952, there were no party congresses. They used to be annual. Every year, there was a party congress during the 1920s. Now, for such a long period, 14 years, no congresses, and not even an explanation why there were no congresses. Stalin changed the anthem of Soviet Union from the International, from International, to the nationalist, Mother Russia, blah, 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 everything. Stalin brought priests back from those surviving in prisons and Gulag. He brought them back. Stalin allowed the military to wear epaulets again. Stalin, this was no longer workers and peasants, and it was a professional military now. So he was rebuilding the empire. He was actually rebuilding, the empire of the Tsars. In the end of his life, it's amazing. Ketoe Kote, right? Tsagareli, Hanuma. Why they were allowed in the Soviet Union? Where are peasants and workers? But even better, my favorite movie from Stalinist time is Arshin Malalan. Do you know what it is? I know. Highly recommended, highly. It's Azerbaijani. It's the first comic opera in the Muslim world, by the way. 1912, very funny. It's about the love of a Muslim merchant to daughter of a Muslim Bek, Azerbaijani Bek, landowner. There are no peasants at all. So if you watch that film, it's beautiful. It's comic opera. It's on YouTube everywhere, and have fun. Once in a while, in Abu Dhabi, I watch it on YouTube. I call my friend, Azerbaijani friend in Munich, living in exile from Azerbaijan, say, hey, you know what I'm listening to here? Let's sing together. You would never suspect that this film was made in a communist country. It's actually very interesting to imagine. I don't have information on how this was watched in Iran under the Shah, how it was watched in Arab countries. It's something quite interesting. By the way, do you know, you hear about all these scandals about caricature of Prophet Muhammad? You know where the first caricature on Prophet Muhammad was published? In Tbilisi. It was Azerbaijani journal. Mullah Nasreddin was an Azerbaijani journal, but it was issued in Tiflis in 1905, right? So we are kind of the center of that, Muslim enlightenment. So Stalin dies in 1953, and ever since the death of Stalin, first, of course, the great reformer is Beria. The second, if you are able to read in Russian, or if you are willing, or I don't suppose anyone reads in Armenian, I just wrote an article which says Deng Xiaoping, the Mikoyan of China. Because they're very comparable with Mikoyan. They're kind of members of totalitarian Politburo, because who was Deng Xiaoping under Mao Zedong? Think about it. But then, Deng Xiaoping was this kind of pragmatist in charge of food supplies, like Mikoyan in Soviet Union. So Mikoyan was really trying. Beria was the first to try to reintegrate the Soviet Union back into capitalism. Beria was killed because there were just personal scores in Politburo, and he was scaring the rest of Politburo. Mikoyan was smart enough to understand that the Russians are not going to tolerate another Caucasian former terrorist and revolutionary as the head of state. That it would have to be a Russian. So it became Nikita Khrushchev instead. And ever since the death of Stalin, they are all trying what? Figure out what to do with the superpower next. Remember yesterday how I ended with the example of Germany and Japan. We actually don't know where Friedrich List policy leads in the end. Because in the end is Obergruppenführer SS Herbert Backe from Batumi, from Georgia, Reichsministerium of Agriculture. Incredible guy. In the end, it's the American occupation. So that trajectory is curtailed. The Soviet trajectory could not be curtailed because they had nuclear weapons. So what happens? And do we have anything else? Cold War. Nothing. Cold War because there could not be an actual war because now the belligerents had nuclear weapons and the experience of Second World War. They understood they could not go to war. War became impossible. Nuclear weapons are really a very potent deterrent in this respect. And both recognized, both belligerents recognized that they have too much to lose from going to war, so they begin a rapprochement. In the 1960s, 1970s, it's amazing how much we forgot about it. It's all about convergence. John Kenneth Galbraith comes up with this idea of convergence that Americans presumably started with free market economy, the Soviets started with totalitarian planned economy, but the Soviets are liberalizing and we are adopting more social provisions and regulations. Eventually we will meet in the golden mean. Of course, on the Soviet side, do you know who was the greatest who in the Soviet leadership is member of the Club of Rome? The futurists, the Club of Rome reports, Well, all the generation, please shut up, you know. Who? He had a very interesting name. His first name was Germain. And Germain comes from two names, Dzerzhinsky, Menzhinsky, the two founders of Cheka. And his last name, Gvishiani. Academician Germain Gvishiani. His father was a right-hand man of Lavrenti Beria. So as my friend Anatol Livin, German-Russian aristocrat, says that, well, yes, Russians exiled Chechens to Central Asia. Russian number one, Gvishiani, Russian number two, Beria, Russian number three, they both reported to Stalin. Yeah, so far. Yes, Gvishiani was directly in charge of the deportation. First-class commissar of NKVD, Gvishiani. His son, Germain Gvishiani, becomes a very enlightened Soviet technocrat. He was in charge of the State Committee for Goskomitet Nauki и Techniki, State Committee for Science and Technology. And what else? Whom did he marry? Remember, I told you a very important book, at least the title, is The Origin of Private Property, State and Family. Who was the wife of Gvishiani? Petra, you must know. He married whom? Kosygin, the daughter of Soviet Prime Minister Kosygin. This is how aristocracy is formed, right? So this, sometimes I think we know this because we're old enough. But is it written somewhere? And Primakov, and when you start looking, was he? And Primakov, who of course is from Tbilisi too. And so you can see actually the Soviet period is the time when Georgia colonizes the Soviet Union, of course. So I've been today to the Museum of Soviet Occupation. It's of course it's very dark humor, understand? But this is it is such a stretch. Well, that's why it is so funny, right? So who occupied whom? So of course, collapse of Soviet Union was a huge tragedy for Georgia, because they lost, their biggest colony. So you have to look for another one. Now, let's go to the next one. So this is the idea, that the Soviet Union would go to another maybe another modernization. So what happened, The cycle, as I explained to you, the cycle happened 3 times. Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Lenin, Stalin. The cycle always begins with repression and the formation of new middle class. Then Great War, and so some success. So we have suffered to show that we are champions of the world. This is, you can imagine this also as preparation for something like Olympic Games. We create a great Olympic team, then we go and we kick ass like Soviet ice hockey team. And then what happens next? We relax, and then intelligentsia emerges, and the dissidents, and the cycle starts again, except that it doesn't. Because the 3 cycles were predicated, somebody asked a very intelligent question last time, 3 cycles were predicated on peasants. Do you know the expression, «Бабы нас подвели, не нарожали»? The women, but «бабы» is kind of a very Russian, rough expression. So it's attributed to several Soviet military commanders, starting with Marshal Zhukov all the way to Pasha Mercedes Grachev from the Chechen War, when they said we don't have enough soldiers to sacrifice like in previous wars. Women let us down. They didn't bear enough sons. True, there was an enormous demographic transition between the 1920s and the 1950s. From 5-6 children per woman, they went to 1.2, right? It's incredible, and it's below the reproduction rate. Yes, because, well, as demographers joke, the best contraceptive is education. But also because of the war, because there were so many positions created for women. Women replace men who are removed to the war duty or who are killed in Stalinist repression. There are so many positions for women. This is one of the most important reasons, demographic reasons for the Soviet Union, but with one very important and very big exception, Central Asia and Azerbaijan. The Muslim parts of Soviet Union still had, and still today have, the reproduction pattern of the third world. Lots of children, low education. The second, I already mentioned, nuclear weapons. So war is both impossible because of technology and because there are no soldiers. And you cannot boss around the population which is educated. You cannot treat them like you used to treat the peasants. So what could you do? Join the European Union. There's basically one thing. No, seriously, there is one thing. And the problem with the European Union is only one from the standpoint of Moscow, that it is the creation of the United States of America. And if European Union becomes really independent, where is the place for the United States there? It's a very pure kind of realpolitik logic of that. So the Soviets tried to play already since the 1950s with members of West European alliance, most importantly with France under Charles de Gaulle, because they're trying to get someone out of that alliance to make their own connection to the core of capitalist world system. Eventually, of course, in the 1970s, they get their luck with West German Ostpolitik and with the Japanese, of course. The elites in Germany and Japan by the 1970s are in a very difficult position themselves because they feel that they have fully restored their countries after the war, after the defeat, but they're still under American occupation. So how could you be, have you ever read Sebastian Haffner? So this is a right-wing German aristocratic conservative who hates Hitler because Hitler denied him the right to be a right-wing German nationalist. He wants to be a big, strong German, proponent of big, strong Germany in Europe. He cannot because of what happened in the 1930s and 40s. Same story in Japan. There are Japanese imperialists. Let's face it, but how could you be a Japanese imperialist when you must kowtow to Americans? So you must make an alliance with big Soviet Union. So one famous story, Germain Gvesciani, whom I already mentioned, receives Kakue Tanaka, Prime Minister of Japan in the 1970s, in Soviet Union, at a reception. And of course, Gvisciani pours wine. What is the wine? You can favorite wine of Comrade Stalin, Kinzmarauli. Kakue Tanaka is explained to us as usual, that of course in Moscow, what else would you hear? What is Kinzmarauli? Why Kinzmarauli is great? So he tries Kinzmarauli, and as a good Japanese, he says, I love this wine. It's beautiful. Thank you for pouring this to me. But if you could pour my glass with oil from Siberia, I would be much more pleased. I would rather drink a glass of oil, right? So Germany, West Germany, and Japan are very interested in the Soviet resources. They are very interested in this big population, which is educated, disciplined, and starving for their consumer goods. For salamander shoes, for Volkswagen and Toyota cars, for the Sony TV sets, right? So now you understand what Gorbachev was really about. Gorbachev was trying to disassemble whatever were the obstacles on his way into the European Union. So you are afraid of our communist ideology. Well, we don't believe in it ourselves, actually. We believe in human values now, right? Общечеловеческие ценности. You are afraid of our army, but look, we withdraw from Afghanistan, we behave ourselves. What else are you afraid of? And for a couple of years, it looked like nothing is left to be afraid of. So, you want independence to the Baltic states? You can have it. They don't matter. They're going to become independent. Poland will be very independent between Germany and Russia. Good luck. Right, in a big unified European Union, which will be from Lisbon to Vladivostok, but in reality, there will be the axis of power: Paris, Berlin, Moscow. Right, this will be an alliance of former imperial powers, державы. And we have to come together because otherwise, you in Europe become dwarfs, economic and geopolitical dwarfs. You already became dwarfs. So the way out for you is to extend to the big Soviet Union. And in Europe, many people begin thinking, yeah, it's actually an interesting proposition. Probably sounds incredible, but what if he means that? And Gorbachev needs to prove that he means that. So when the Berlin Wall, where I was, a friend of mine who works in TASS agency calls me on the 7th of October, '89, and says, are you following, I'm sitting in front of TV set, are you following what he is saying in Berlin? Said, I have the text of his speech. There was not a single word about the walls coming down, and he just said that. Gorbachev inserted that phrase famously. 2 days later, as you know, it began. Gorbachev actually meant it, but what happened to Gorbachev? He was afraid, all along, he was afraid of the fate of Khrushchev. He was afraid of his own apparat. He was afraid of his own secret service, of KGB. He did not realize that he should be really very afraid of people in the squares, in the streets. He was completely unprepared to what happened first. And again, he was very afraid of what could happen in Western Ukraine. He did not expect what Armenians did in February '88, demanding Karabakh. The Soviet power first collapses, and this is in that book you have, yes. The Soviet power really collapses first in by far the most loyal pro-Russian republic of all of them, in Armenia. Precisely because Armenians thought that, is it a big deal? Transfer small province of Karabakh from one Soviet republic to another Soviet republic. It's already called Armenian Autonomous Oblast. So what's the deal? Armenians really could not understand why Gorbachev could not follow them. Next, of course, are Georgians. They are very upset about what is happening in Abkhazia, what is the quota for Georgians in entrance examinations in Sukhumi State University, what is going on there. And then it begins to snowball, the snowballing effect. Nobody expected, lots of unintended consequences. In the end, the Soviet Union is disassembled by its own elites. Most importantly, by Ukrainian elite. So the moment that people like Kravchuk, so aren't you suspicious, that the most important blow to the Soviet Union was delivered by the defection of Ukrainian communist leadership. Ukrainians were die-hard Soviets. Kravchuk in the previous how many, 12 years, had been secretary for ideology. So he was in charge of suppressing Ukrainian nationalism. Or another favorite example, Haydar Aliyevich Aliyev, when he said that he joined the Soviet Politburo with the secret desire to serve the Azerbaijani nation, to protect them against the Armenians. Because he said, see, as long as I was in Politburo, Armenians were quiet. Once, he was purged in November 1987. My favorite is, of course, Johar Musayevich Dudayev, Soviet general, Air Force general, when he was asked by journalists, Johar Musayevich, but as a Chechen, did you observe Islamic presence? Of course. I secretly prayed 3 times a day. And then, Mevlady Udugov sitting next to him saying, Johar, it's 5 times. Oh, чем больше, тем лучше, The more, the merrier. So it was in the beginning almost laughable. But then what is the effect, So when the Soviet first secretaries saw the execution of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, when they saw what happened to Erich Honecker, they realized very clearly one terrible thing. Moscow is both useless and dangerous. Dangerous because they can replace you, like, look what they have done in Uzbekistan, the cotton affair. Between 1982 and 88, Moscow had replaced 92% of nomenclature in Uzbekistan. This is more than Stalinist repression. But at the same time, if somebody like, Zviad Gamsahurdi happens in your country, or Ruch in Ukraine, or Karabakh Committee in Armenia, Moscow is also useless. They are not going to protect you. So what's the point of holding to it? And then they realize, that there are 3 very simple things. Local intelligentsia everywhere in the Soviet republics wanted 3 things. National sovereignty, you can have it. And I'm your president immediately. I declare national sovereignty, and I'm president of Turkmenistan, Turkmenbashi. Please meet Turkmenbashi. Second, you wanted elections immediately. Even before you counted to 3, you're going to have the elections, and all my apparatus is working on it. Guess who is going to be elected? And number 3, you all wanted market reform and privatization. And somehow it just so happened that the son-in-law of the president gets appointed billionaire, what happened in Ukraine and elsewhere, right? 3 things. You wanted national independence? I'm Turkmenbashi. You wanted elections? You will get them. You wanted privatization? You get the oligarchy. But as the result, then Emanuel Wallerstein's, Terence Hopkins, famous expression from 1991, by going down this way, East Europeans will reach the promised shores of America. But not North America, but only South America, which is exactly what happened. We reached America. We are at the level of America, of South America. What is going to happen next? That will have to be another lecture. Thank you very much.